The morning sun cast a pale glow over the academy courtyard, its light touching the edges of the flagpoles and glinting against the crisp boots of the cadets as they assembled for the inspection. Among the neat rows of uniforms, freshly pressed and gleaming with polish, there was one figure who stood out, not for excellence but for the opposite. Her name was Aisha, and her uniform told a story she would never put into words. The fabric was worn at the elbows, faded at the seams, and though she had done her best to scrub it clean, there were faint marks that spoke of years of use. The cadets next to her, children of wealthy families, heirs of decorated officers, snickered as they exchanged glances. Couldn't she even manage a decent uniform? One of them whispered, loud enough for others to hear. The laughter rippled, not cruel enough to call attention from the instructors, but sharp enough to pierce her pride. She stood stiffly, her back straight, her chin lifted, refusing to let her discomfort show. She knew the truth. This uniform was all she had, handed down from her late father, a man who had worn it with honor. Each faded thread was a reminder of the sacrifices he had made, and she wore it not with shame, but with silent reverence. Yet in the eyes of those around her, it was only a badge of poverty, an invitation for mockery. As the cadet stood waiting, she felt the sting of the whispers intensify. Someone muttered about hand-me-downs from the graveyard, and another chuckled at the scuffed boots she had polished until her fingers were raw. Aisha clenched her jaw, refusing to flinch. Her father had always told her that discipline was not just about marching in step, but about holding one's ground when others tried to knock you down. She replayed his words in her head, steadying herself, but the cruel amusement of her peers gnawed at the edges of her composure. Still, she stood tall, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though the laughter did not exist. But inside, a small ache grew, a question of whether she truly belonged here among them, or if she was just a shadow of a legacy she could never live up to. The academy courtyard suddenly hushed as the sound of heavy boots echoed from the far end. A figure of authority entered the grounds and the air shifted at once. It was Brigadier General Rahman, a man whose presence alone commanded silence. His uniform was immaculate, his medals glinting under the sunlight, and his gaze was sharp enough to unsettle even the boldest cadet. The lines straightened, backs stiffened, and the whispers died instantly. Every cadet knew the reputation of the Brigadier General. He was a man who had fought in conflicts most of them had only read about in history books, a leader who had risen from the ranks by sheer grit and courage. His inspections were legendary not because he barked or scolded, but because he noticed everything. Nothing escaped his eye, not the polish of a button, not the alignment of a boot heel, not the tremor of a wavering stance. And now, his gaze swept slowly across the courtyard like a searchlight. He moved down the rows, stopping briefly to glance at a cadet's insignia, or to adjust the strap of another's belt, his silence speaking louder than any rebuke. The cadets held their breath as he passed, each secretly hoping to remain invisible, to escape notice. When he reached the line where Aisha stood, her heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the weight of every sneer that had been cast at her earlier, as though the ridicule of her peers had crystallized into a spotlight shining solely on her. For a moment, she feared that he too would see only the frayed threads, the weary fabric, the tired boots. He stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable, and the courtyard seemed to shrink around them. The laughter from earlier still echoed in her ears, and she braced herself for the humiliation that might follow. But the Brigadier General did not look at her scuffed boots or the faded fabric. His eyes, sharp yet strangely gentle, fell instead on the small patch sewn carefully above her chest pocket, the unit tag. It was old, the colors dulled with age but still intact. His gaze lingered there, and for a brief moment, his stern face softened. Slowly he reached out, brushing a gloved hand over the tag as if confirming that it was real. Then he looked at her, and the silence deepened. The cadets around her shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what he had noticed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of command but also something else, something personal. "Cadet," he said, "where did you get this uniform?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, though his tone lacked accusation. Aisha swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she forced her voice steady. "Sir, it belonged to my father. He served in the 14th Battalion until his last day." The Brigadier General's eyes narrowed slightly as if searching his memory. Then recognition sparked, and his gaze hardened with an intensity that made the cadets nearby glance nervously at one another. For a moment, the Brigadier General said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the unit tag, his fingers brushing over the worn stitching as though it were a relic from another era. The courtyard, filled with hundreds of cadets, was so silent that even the faint rustle of the flag above seemed deafening. "The 14th Battalion," he repeated slowly, his voice distant, as though he were speaking to ghosts only he could see. "Your father's name, Cadet?" Aisha's throat tightened, but she spoke clearly. "Captain Farouk, sir." At once, something changed in the Brigadier General's expression. His posture straightened even more, and for the first time, the steel mask of command slipped to reveal something deeply human: recognition, respect, and perhaps even sorrow. He had known that name. The cadets around her, who had minutes before snickered at her worn sleeves and scuffed boots, now looked uneasy. They had never seen the general pause like this, never seen his stern authority touched by memory. Aisha felt the heat of their gazes pressing against her, but for once, there was no laughter, no whispering. Only silence, heavy and expectant. The Brigadier General drew in a slow breath, as if steadying himself. "Captain Farouk," he said finally, his voice carrying both weight and reverence, "was one of the finest men I ever served with." His words cut through the courtyard like thunder, each syllable commanding not just attention but respect. He turned his eyes to Aisha again, his gaze softer now, yet piercing. "He saved my life during the Northern Campaign. We were ambushed in the mountains, outnumbered, cut off from supplies. Many believed we would never return. But your father?" He paused, his jaw tightening, his voice threatening to falter, though he forced it steady. "Your father stood his ground. He rallied us, carried the wounded on his back, and fought until the reinforcements arrived. Without him, I would not be standing here today." A hush fell deeper over the cadets. They shifted awkwardly, suddenly aware of the enormity of their earlier ridicule. The uniform they had mocked, the threadbare fabric they had scorned, had once been worn by a man whose courage had altered the course of a battle. The laughter that had seemed so easy, so harmless, now weighed like a stone in their throats. Aisha stood frozen, her heart pounding as the Brigadier General's words washed over her. She had always known her father had been a good man, but hearing this, hearing that he had saved the life of one of the most respected officers in the country, was more than she could have imagined. Her chest swelled with pride, but she kept her composure, standing at attention, her chin held high, even as her eyes burned with unshed tears. The Brigadier General took a step back, his gaze sweeping across the courtyard, fixing on the faces of the cadets who had mocked her. "And you dare laugh," he said quietly, though his words carried with the force of a shout. The shame was immediate, and no cadet could hold his gaze. They looked down, their polished boots suddenly fascinating, their faces pale under the weight of his reproach. "This uniform," he continued, pointing to the worn fabric on Aisha's arm, "is not a mark of poverty. It is a badge of honor. Every stitch tells a story, every faded line a memory of sacrifice. If you cannot respect that, then you have no right to wear a uniform yourselves." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind dared intrude. Aisha could feel the heat rising in her chest, not from shame but from a fierce, unyielding pride. The same cadets who had ridiculed her minutes ago now shifted uneasily, wishing they could disappear into the ground. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt the invisible wall that had separated her from her peers begin to crack. The Brigadier General turned back to her, his eyes softer now, and gave the slightest nod. "Your father would be proud to see you here, Cadet Aisha. And so am I." The words struck deep, steadying her like an anchor. For so long she had felt the weight of doubt pressing on her shoulders, the constant whispers of not being good enough, not belonging. But in that moment she knew she had a place here, not because of pity, not because of charity, but because her blood carried the legacy of courage and service. As the Brigadier General moved on, the courtyard slowly seemed to breathe again. The cadets straightened, though the mocking smirks had vanished from their faces, replaced with something else, uneasy respect. Some glanced at her, not with mockery this time but with guilt, others with quiet admiration. Aisha kept her eyes forward, refusing to show any triumph. Her father had taught her that honor was not about humiliating those who doubted you, but about standing tall regardless of their opinion. Still, deep inside, a small flame of vindication burned brightly. The same uniform they had mocked had been the very thing that commanded the respect of a Brigadier General. And though the laughter had wounded her, the General's words had healed something deeper, affirming her place not just in the academy, but in the shadow of her father's legacy. When the inspection ended and the cadets were dismissed, the courtyard erupted into murmurs. Some avoided her entirely, ashamed of their earlier cruelty, while others approached hesitantly, their voices awkward as they offered quiet words of respect. "I didn't know about your father," one muttered. Another shifted uncomfortably before saying, "That was impressive." She accepted their words politely, though she neither gloated nor forgave so easily. Respect earned through another story was fragile, and she knew it would take more than her father's memory to prove her own worth. But she also knew that the tide had shifted. The mocking would not return so easily. For now she had been seen, not as the girl with the worn uniform, but as the daughter of a man who had changed the course of a battle and the life of a brigadier general. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the academy grounds fell quiet, Aisha returned to her small room. She hung the uniform carefully, her hands brushing over the faded fabric as though it were something sacred. For years she had worn it with the weight of shame pressed against her back, hearing only the laughter of others. But now when she looked at it she no longer saw only the frayed threads. She saw her father's courage, his sacrifice, his honor. And now she saw her own strength reflected in it too. As she closed her eyes that night, her father's words came back to her once more, "Hold your ground no matter what." And she knew she had. The following days at the academy carried a new weight. Where once the corridors echoed with the muffled laughter of cadets mocking her frayed sleeves, now they carried whispers of something else: curiosity, respect, and unease. Aisha walked through those halls with her usual calm stride, her chin lifted and her eyes forward, but she could feel the shift in the air. No one dared laugh when she passed now. Instead they watched, some with guilt, others with reluctant admiration. A few even tried to strike conversations, hoping to wash away the sting of their past ridicule. But Aisha did not crave their friendship. She had endured their cruelty in silence, and now she did not need their sudden change of heart. What she wanted was something greater, to prove that she was more than just her father's daughter, more than just a memory wrapped in worn fabric. If the brigadier general could see her for who she truly was, then perhaps one day the rest would too. Training intensified as the semester progressed. Dawn drills became harsher, lectures more demanding, and physical trials more grueling. Aisha threw herself into every challenge with relentless determination. When the others complained of blisters, she pushed her body further. When they groaned at the weight of their packs, she tightened her straps and marched on. She had learned endurance not from books or instructors, but from a life of struggle long before she stepped foot on academy grounds. Hunger, loss, grief, those had been her first drills. Compared to them, mud, exhaustion, and bruises were nothing. Slowly instructors began to take notice. Though her uniform remained the most battered among them, her posture, her sharp focus, and her refusal to quit marked her as different. One sergeant, known for his biting sarcasm, muttered under his breath after one of her sprints, "That girl runs like she's chasing ghosts." Aisha heard it but did not respond. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was carrying one with her every step. Despite her growing strength, the shadow of her father's name hung heavy. Some cadets whispered that she was being favored, that the brigadier general's acknowledgement meant she was shielded from scrutiny. It stung her, but she didn't let it show. She knew better than anyone that respect handed down from another's deeds was fragile. If she faltered, even once, those whispers would sharpen into open scorn. So she worked harder. Every night, when her peers collapsed onto their bunks, she remained awake, her lamp burning low as she polished her boots until they gleamed, or reviewed her notes until her eyes blurred. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, not when her every move was watched, not when failure meant proving her critics right. In the quiet hours, when exhaustion threatened to swallow her, she would look at her father's unit tag and remind herself why she was here. She wasn't simply surviving their judgment. She was building her own legacy. One rainy afternoon, the cadets were sent to the field for a survival exercise. The ground was slick, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth, and every step sank boots into thick mud. The task was simple on paper. Navigate through the forest, find the checkpoints, and return before nightfall. But simple on paper often meant brutal in practice. The rain turned the terrain treacherous, compasses stuck, and maps grew soggy and unreadable. Squads stumbled, tempers flared, and alliances formed only to break apart under pressure. Aisha was placed with a group of cadets who had once been the loudest in mocking her. Their smirks had since been tempered into uneasy silence, but the memory of their laughter lingered in her mind. She had no intention of depending on them, but she also knew survival in the field demanded more than pride. So she bit down her bitterness and focused on the task. While the others argued over direction, she quietly studied the terrain, noting landmarks, the flow of the streams, the slope of the land. Her father had taught her to read the earth like a book, long before she had ever stepped into a classroom. When their chosen path led them in circles, it was she who calmly corrected their course, guiding them with quiet authority. Hours passed, the rain unrelenting and exhaustion gnawed at every muscle. One cadet stumbled, twisting his ankle, and frustration erupted in the group. Some muttered about leaving him behind, fearful of missing the deadline. Aisha stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "No one gets left behind," she said firmly, the echo of her father's voice in her own. She tore strips from her worn uniform to bind his ankle, ignoring the sting of giving up what little she had. Then she shouldered his weight, carrying him despite the mud dragging at her boots. The others fell silent, shame written across their faces as they followed her lead. Step by step, she carried him through the forest until they reached the final checkpoint just as dusk painted the sky in fading gold. When the instructors tallied the groups, theirs was marked not only for completion but for teamwork. The cadet she had carried whispered hoarsely, "I'm sorry," but Aisha said nothing. Forgiveness was not what she sought. She wanted them to remember the image, the girl in the worn uniform carrying more than her share, because that was what true soldiers did. When word of the exercise reached the Brigadier General, he was not surprised. He had seen the fire in her eyes during inspection, the strength in her silence. Still, he called her to his office the next morning. She stood at attention, rain still damp in her hair, her uniform more tattered than ever from the day before. The Brigadier General regarded her quietly for a long moment before speaking. "Your father was a leader," he said at last. "But leadership is not inherited. It is earned. Yesterday you earned it." Aisha's heart pounded, but she kept her composure, replying only with a crisp, "Yes, sir." His lips curved into the faintest smile before he dismissed her. As she left his office, she carried not only the weight of her father's memory but the beginning of something new, her own name, her own honor, slowly being etched into the legacy she was determined to build. The days that followed the survival exercise seemed to shift the balance in the academy in ways Aisha had not anticipated. No longer was she merely tolerated or ignored, she was watched. In the training fields, cadets stole glances at her as though measuring themselves against her quiet endurance. During lectures, when she raised her hand to answer a question, the instructors gave her space to speak, and her peers listened with a seriousness they had not before afforded her. Respect had begun to take root, though unevenly. Some cadets accepted her resilience with grudging admiration, while others, threatened by the idea that the girl they once mocked might surpass them, grew resentful. Aisha sensed the tension building, but she did not let it shake her. Her father had told her that envy was as common in the barracks as mud on boots, and that the only cure for it was consistency. She did not need to fight for their approval, she needed only to keep walking her path until it spoke for itself. One evening, the academy hosted a lecture on battlefield ethics, delivered once again by Brigadier General Rahman. The great hall was filled, cadets sitting shoulder to shoulder, their notebooks open, their pens poised. The general spoke not of tactics or weapons but of choices, those moments when orders collided with conscience, when a soldier had to decide between survival and sacrifice. His voice was measured, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too many crossroads where lives were won or lost by a single decision. Aisha listened intently, every word stirring echoes of her father's teachings. Then, during the Q&A session, a cadet raised his hand and asked a question with a sly undertone. "Sir, what if a soldier wears a uniform that isn't truly theirs, one they didn't earn? Shouldn't that be considered a dishonor?" A ripple passed through the room, eyes darting toward Aisha. She felt the familiar sting of scrutiny, but this time she did not bow her head. The Brigadier General's gaze sharpened. "Uniforms are cloth," he said firmly. "What matters is the weight carried in them. If a soldier honors the legacy they wear, then they have earned it with every drop of sweat, every act of courage. And if another dares to mock that, it is not the uniform they disgrace but themselves." His eyes swept the room, and for a brief moment, they lingered on Aisha, though his words were directed at everyone. The cadet who had asked the question flushed crimson, realizing the rebuke was not only clear but final. Despite the general's defense, resentment simmered beneath the surface. A few cadets, particularly those from powerful families, could not stand the idea that someone with nothing but a tattered uniform and a famous father's name might eclipse them. Their envy turned to hostility, though veiled beneath smiles and polite words. Aisha sensed it in the way their conversations hushed when she entered, in the sidelong glances that carried daggers, in the subtle obstacles that seemed to appear during group drills. They tried to undermine her, to trip her in small, hidden ways. But Aisha had grown up surviving far harsher battles. Where they sought to unsettle her, she grew sharper. Their whispered insults became fuel, their sabotage a test she refused to fail. And each time she endured, their hatred deepened, because they could not understand a strength born from scars they had never known. The true test came during the mid-year combat evaluation, a brutal series of exercises designed to push cadets to their limits. It combined endurance runs with live combat simulations, demanding not only physical strength but strategy and nerve. Aisha was paired with a squad that included some of her fiercest critics. From the start, they tried to sideline her, giving her menial tasks, dismissing her input on strategy. But when the simulation began, their arrogance quickly unraveled. They charged recklessly into ambushes, ignored warnings and wasted ammunition. Within the first hour, 2 of their squad members were marked casualties by the instructors overseeing the exercise. Panic set in and the squad fractured. Amid the chaos, Aisha stepped forward. "We regroup," she ordered, her voice cutting through their panic. "We move to higher ground and establish defense before pushing forward." Some hesitated, unwilling to take orders from her, but desperation overruled pride. They followed, grudgingly at first, but when her plan led them out of another ambush and into a defensible position, air skepticism began to waver. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion gnawed at them, but Aisha's steady leadership kept them moving. She rationed their supplies, redirected their movements, and took the heaviest burdens without complaint. When one cadet faltered, she lifted his pack onto her own shoulders, her muscles screaming but her will unbroken. Slowly, the squad that had once resented her began to see her differently. They began to follow without question, not because they wanted to, but because she had earned it through sheer competence. By the time they reached the final checkpoint, battered and drenched in sweat, they were one of the few squads that had not been fully eliminated. The instructors took note, marking their performance as exemplary. When the scores were announced later, their squad stood among the highest. The cadets who had sought to undermine her now found themselves indebted to her leadership. The bitter taste of their envy was replaced by reluctant respect, though some could not admit it aloud. That night, lying in her bunk, Aisha stared at the ceiling, her body aching from the day's exertion. The whispers in the hall had changed once again. She was no longer simply the girl with the worn uniform. She was becoming something else in their eyes, someone they could not easily dismiss. Still, she did not let pride swell within her. She knew this was only the beginning. Respect could be fleeting and every day brought new trials. Yet as she closed her eyes, she allowed herself a small moment of peace. Her father's shadow still loomed large, but for the first time she felt she was beginning to step out of it, not by erasing his legacy, but by building her own alongside it. Winter settled over the academy like a heavy cloak. Frost clung to the training grounds in the early mornings, and the cadets' breaths rose in white plumes as they ran drills before dawn. The cold bit through even the thickest uniforms, and many complained bitterly, their soft upbringing unprepared for the relentless weather. For Aisha, the chill was harsh but not unfamiliar. She had grown up in winters that showed no mercy, winters where firewood was scarce and blankets were thin, winters where survival meant grit, not comfort. So while others shivered and cursed, she endured in silence, her worn uniform layered with little more than resolve. The cold became another test, one she passed by refusing to bend. Still, she knew that the season brought more than weather. It brought the most grueling stage of their training, the endurance march across the frozen highlands, a trial designed to weed out the weak and forge resilience in the strong. The cadets were assembled at the edge of the highlands before dawn one icy morning, their packs heavy, their rifles strapped, their boots crunching against snow. The instructors gave simple instructions: survive the march, reach the rendezvous point, and bring your entire squad intact. The distance was long, the terrain unforgiving, and the frost-laced wind cut like blades against exposed skin. Aisha tightened the straps of her pack, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Around her, cadets muttered and grumbled, but she stood silent, the lessons of her father echoing in her mind. Pace yourself, conserve strength, and never let the enemy see your weakness. Here the enemy was not bullets or ambushes, it was the cold, the exhaustion, the temptation to quit. At first, the march began with forced bravado. Some cadets charged ahead, eager to prove themselves, mocking those who lagged behind. But bravado wilted quickly in the biting wind. Boots grew heavy with snow, shoulders ached beneath the weight of packs, and the endless white horizon drained morale faster than any enemy fire. Aisha kept her pace measured, steady, refusing to rush. When one cadet stumbled on the ice, she offered her arm. When another fell silent, his lips blue with cold, she adjusted his scarf, pushing him onward. She did not do it for recognition or thanks. She did it because she could not watch anyone falter while she still had strength left to give. Her squad, which included both allies and former mockers, began to realize that her endurance was not just physical. It was a force that pulled them forward, a steady flame in the storm. By the second day the march had become brutal. The snow deepened, the wind howled with a fury that clawed at their bones, and rations grew scarce. Some cadets whispered of giving up, of signaling for evacuation, but Aisha silenced such talk with the firmness of her gaze. "We finish this," she said simply, and the conviction in her voice left no room for argument. Her leadership became instinctive. She rotated burdens among the squad, shared what little food she had, and kept their spirits alive with her unyielding presence. When they crossed a frozen stream, she tested the ice herself first, her boots sinking slightly before she motioned the others across. Her hands grew raw from the cold, her uniform more tattered from the strain, but she pressed on. The memory of her father marching through snow-laden mountains during his campaigns lived in her veins. If he could do it, so could she. On the third night, disaster struck. A storm descended with little warning, blinding snow whipping through the highlands, erasing tracks and disorienting even the most skilled navigators. Squads scattered, their lanterns dim pinpricks swallowed by the storm. Aisha's squad huddled together, the howling wind threatening to tear them apart. Fear crept into their eyes, the kind of fear that turns strong cadets into broken shells. But Aisha did not allow it to take root. She raised her voice above the storm, steady and commanding. "Form a line, hold the rope, no one lets go. We move as one." She tore strips from her pack and fashioned them into bindings, tying the squad together so the storm could not scatter them. Step by step, they trudged through the white chaos, Aisha at the front, her face stung raw by the wind, her body screaming for rest. But she kept moving because she knew that stopping meant death. She imagined her father walking beside her, his hand on her shoulder, reminding her that true strength was not the absence of fear but the refusal to yield to it. Hours later, when the storm finally broke, her squad stumbled into the rendezvous point, battered but intact. They collapsed to the ground, frostbitten and exhausted but alive. Out of the dozens of squads that had set out, only a handful had managed to arrive with every member still standing. Instructors took notes, their eyes widening when they saw who led one of those squads. Brigadier General Rahman himself stood waiting at the camp, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the survivors. When his gaze fell on Aisha, mud-stained, frostbitten, and wrapped in her father's worn uniform, he gave a slow nod. No words were exchanged, but the acknowledgement was enough. She had proven herself not once, but again and again, in ways that no sneer or envy could erase. That night, as the cadets lay in tents, nursing their wounds, Aisha sat outside by the fire. The flames flickered, painting her face in gold and shadow, while the snow around her glowed faintly in the moonlight. She thought of the laughter that had once haunted her, the ridicule that had threatened to break her. And she thought of how far she had come, not because the laughter had stopped, but because she had refused to let it define her. She was no longer just the girl in the worn uniform. She was the cadet who had led her squad through the storm, who had carried others when they could not carry themselves, who had stood unyielding against both mockery and the elements. And though the journey ahead was long, she knew now that she was walking it not just in her father's shadow, but in her own light. Spring crept slowly into the academy, thawing the frostbitten fields and painting the grounds in shades of green once more. The harsh trials of winter left their mark. Cadets limped with healing injuries, bandaged fingers, and eyes that had seen the unforgiving side of nature. Yet with survival came pride. Those who had endured the endurance march wore their fatigue like a medal, their stories retold in whispers over meals and late-night conversations. Among those stories, one name rose repeatedly: Aisha. Even cadets who had once mocked her spoke now with reluctant admiration, for her leadership during the storm had carried an entire squad to safety. But Aisha did not bask in their shifting opinions. Praise was fleeting, she had learned that lesson too well. Her focus remained fixed on the horizon, the upcoming final exams that would decide who advanced to officer candidacy and who would be dismissed from the academy. For Aisha, failure was not an option. She carried her father's name, yes, but she also carried her own determination to forge a place in the ranks by merit alone. The final evaluation loomed over every cadet like a storm cloud. Unlike drills and simulations, this was the test that mattered most. It combined every skill they had learned: strategy, endurance, leadership, combat, and decision-making under pressure. Rumors spread quickly through the dormitories about what it might entail: live-fire drills, night raids, or even urban combat simulations. Instructors revealed nothing, their silence adding to the tension that thickened with each passing day. Aisha trained harder than ever, her evenings spent running extra laps, her nights bent over maps and tactical manuals. Some cadets burned themselves out with panic, while others grew cocky, convinced their wealthy families and connections would carry them through. Aisha ignored both extremes. She sharpened her body and mind with quiet discipline, knowing that when the time came, no excuse would save her if she faltered. When the day of the final evaluation arrived, dawn broke over the academy in streaks of pale gold. The cadets were assembled in full gear, their nerves taut, their breaths shallow. Brigadier General Rahman himself stood at the front, his eyes scanning the assembled ranks with his usual piercing gaze. "This test," he said, his voice echoing across the field, "is not about who you are or where you come from. It is about who you become under pressure. You will face scenarios designed to break you, to expose weakness. Some of you will fail. But those who endure, those who lead, those who refuse to yield, those will be the officers of tomorrow." His words carried no embellishment, no theatrics, only truth. The weight of them settled over the cadets like armor, both heavy and necessary. The evaluation began with a forced march into the forest, packs weighed down with supplies, rifles slung across shoulders. Already exhausted from anticipation, many cadets groaned under the load, but the pace was relentless. Hours later, they were divided into squads and given their mission: infiltrate a fortified position, secure hostages, and extract without detection. The exercise was simulated but brutal in its realism, complete with mock enemy units, traps, and timed objectives. Aisha found herself once again paired with cadets who had once despised her. Their faces were pale, their nerves fraying, but there was no room for personal grudges here. She quickly assumed command, her voice calm yet firm. "We move in silence, no wasted steps. Watch the ridges, keep low, and follow signals." For a moment, some hesitated, but the memory of her winter leadership silenced any objection. They followed. Moving through the dense forest was a test in itself. Birds scattered at their approach, branches snapped under careless boots, and the threat of discovery lingered like a shadow. Aisha led them with precision, using terrain to their advantage, signaling silently when to halt or advance. At one point, when enemy scouts passed dangerously close, she pressed her squad into the undergrowth, her hand steady on her rifle, her breathing calm despite her pounding heart. They went unnoticed, slipping past like ghosts. Step by step, she maneuvered them toward the objective, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risks. Every decision was calculated, every action deliberate. Her squad, once doubtful, began to move with cohesion, their trust in her growing as the mission unfolded. When they reached the fortified position, the real test began. Guards patrolled the perimeter, searchlights sweeping the clearing. Time was slipping away and panic threatened to set in. One cadet muttered about rushing in, another about retreating. Aisha silenced them with a single look. "We go around. The ridge gives us cover. 2 flank left, 3 with me. We move when the light shifts." Her voice carried certainty, and they obeyed. Crawling through mud and brush, they reached the ridge undetected. With silent hand signals, Aisha directed their movements, positioning them with tactical precision. When the moment came, they struck swiftly, subduing guards, breaching the perimeter, and securing the hostages with speed that even the instructors watching from afar had not expected. The extraction was grueling, with simulated enemy reinforcements pursuing, but Aisha kept them moving, her commands crisp, her focus unwavering. By the time they reached the designated extraction point, battered but intact, the evaluators marked their squad as one of the few to succeed. When the exercise ended, cadets collapsed in exhaustion, some weeping from relief, others simmering in frustration at their failures. Aisha sat quietly, her body aching, her uniform once again torn and muddied. But she felt no shame in its state. It was proof of struggle, proof of survival. Brigadier General Rahman appeared once more, his eyes scanning the weary faces. When his gaze met Aisha's, he paused. He said nothing, but in that pause was an acknowledgement that needed no words. She had done what many thought impossible. She had led, she had endured, and she had triumphed, not because of her father's name but because of her own strength. That night, lying in her bunk, Aisha allowed herself a rare smile. The journey was not over, far from it. But she had crossed a threshold. The laughter that once followed her had long since died, replaced now with a silence heavy with respect. And in that silence she found peace. Graduation week arrived with an air of anticipation unlike anything Aisha had experienced before. The academy was alive with a strange mix of relief and dread, relief that years of grueling training had finally culminated in this moment, and dread of the results that would decide their future. Uniforms were pressed, boots polished, rifles cleaned to perfection, but none of it could conceal the tension humming in the halls. Cadets whispered late into the night, speculating about rankings and assignments, about who would be commissioned as officers and who would be quietly dismissed. Aisha, though outwardly calm, felt the same storm within her chest. She had endured scorn, isolation, and hardship. She had proven herself in